Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of William Taft, and the focus is Roosevelt's jack of all trades. The year is 1904, it's February 1st, and Taft is being sworn in as the next Secretary of War, essentially going to be the right hand in the cabinet to President Roosevelt. He still was going to oversee the operation in the Philippines, where he'd served as Governor General for the last couple of years, but he was going to be so much more than that for Roosevelt over the next 4 years, his top advisor at home, and certainly his top advisor in going abroad at times of crisis. The Taft would set up shop just a couple of blocks away from the White House and the War Department so he could walk to work easily every day. Nellie Taft, exactly where she wanted to be. She was thrilled. She didn't want her husband going back to the judiciary. She wanted him in the seat, in the center of things, in the political world, the executive branch, in Roosevelt's cabinet, the presidency on the horizon. Nellie Taft is thrilled. In fact, Taft is pretty happy himself. He's working for one of his closest friends, and he said, "I love my chief and I admire him from top to toe." He and Roosevelt were like this. Roosevelt had complete trust in Taft. Whenever he would go out of town, he would say, "I have left Taft sitting on the lid," completely confident that everything was going to be just fine. Well, just fine was not where Taft would typically find himself at the beginning of a crisis, one after another after another. These were problem areas beginning for Roosevelt in Panama. Now, Theodore Roosevelt had actually had a hand in Panama getting its independence from Colombia. Roosevelt wanted a canal. He wanted it to go through Panama. The Colombians were not on board, and so when Panama declared its own independence, Roosevelt had a U.S. Navy vessel in the area. The Colombians, I don't want to mess with the Americans. They backed off. Panama got its independence, and the Americans negotiated a treaty to build a canal. But progress was not being made. Things were basically at a standstill, and Roosevelt said, "I'm going to send in Will Taft." Well, Taft found that changes were needed right away. Organizational model needed to be different, logistics, supply chain, free trade needed to be established between Panama and the Canal Zone. Economics were not working out, so we negotiated that deal. One of the biggest things, though, was disease, malaria, yellow fever. This had been such a problem for when the French tried to build this canal and thousands had died. Well, the Americans had actually had some success in this area in Cuba under Colonel William Gorgas, who realized that mosquitoes were a root of many of these diseases in the Caribbean area. And so what did he do? He figured out what he could dry up the swamps, the breeding ground of the mosquitoes. The mosquitoes would die off, and all of a sudden the rates of disease went way down. Could Taft replicate that in Panama? Well, he brought in Gorgas to try it out, and sure enough, they drained those swamps, had a tremendous drop in disease, a lot easier to get workers, may be able to make some progress. Taft also had some logistical concerns with the way the civilian engineers were doing things. He said, "Look, I got the best engineers in the world working for me in the Army Corps of Engineers." So he brought in Major George Goethals, put him in charge, new railroads, other logistical changes. Finally, things started to move. Now, Taft was Secretary of War. He had a lot of other things to do, but he remained hands-on with the Panama situation. 7 trips over the next 7 years. Certainly a very proud man when the Panama Canal finally opened for business in 1914. The Philippines continued to be very important to Taft, and he was lobbying Congress left and right to continue to give support, in fact, give even more support. Sometimes it was backtracking, and so he said, "Look, why don't you guys come along? I'll take you on a trip, see for yourself the progress we're making and the impact the Americans are having in the Philippines." And so he had about 30 that he invited. About 80 people eventually signed on for this trip, including Alice Longworth, a reverent oldest daughter of Theodore Roosevelt. She was sort of what everybody was focusing on this trip, but it was a hard work effort as well, as the Tafts were welcomed with open arms. They were still revered in the Philippines. Great receptions and a lot of positive commentary from the Filipino people was convincing for many of these congressional members on this trip. Taft came home. He was exhausted. He'd also been stressed. He'd been eating a lot, back up to about 320 pounds. He needed a little rest. Over the next 6 months, he brought that weight down back to about 250 as he continued to struggle with the changes in his weight over the years. Well, there was another change in the Roosevelt cabinet. Secretary of State John Hay passed away. Roosevelt wanted his team together with his top 2 advisors. And who were those 2? Well, he's got Will Taft already. He wanted Elihu Root back. The former Secretary of War had gone back to his private business. Roosevelt pushed hard. Root didn't want to come. It's hard to say no to Roosevelt. He came back as Secretary of State, and they started calling the threesome the Three Musketeers. They were so collaborative. Roosevelt was D'Artagnan, Athos was for Root, and Taft was Pathos. Sometimes they would even use these monikers in their correspondence with each other. They're very different, Root and Taft. Root was the truth teller. He was going to tell Roosevelt what he believed was the right answer, no matter what Roosevelt thought. Taft was more the yes man. Yes, sir, you want to do that? I'll take care of it. You want me to do this? I'll take care of it. So different personalities, but extremely compatible, extremely productive. Roosevelt had exactly the two people he wanted, but he was willing to give one of them up. That whole thing about the Supreme Court, it came up again. 1906, Harry Brown resigns from the court, and Roosevelt, he knows that Taft wants to go to the court, and he gives him the offer. We'll put you on the court, finally your dream job, but there's a lot of pushback. This is the job Taft should have taken, but one of the people, the one who he listened to, of course, the most, his wife Nellie, was adamantly against. According to Taft, she, Nellie, was bitterly opposed to my accepting the court position and warned him he would be making the biggest mistake of my life if he accepted it. Well, maybe she thought the biggest mistake of her life, because the fact is, this was the biggest mistake of his life by not accepting the court position. He was much more attuned to that life. He could have spent 25 years on the court doing what he wanted, making a difference, but instead the cloud of the presidency was everywhere. Roosevelt had already said he wasn't going to run. Root didn't want to make the run. That left Taft as the heir apparent. Nellie is pushing, so he turned down the court. We'll see how that comes together in future episodes. Meanwhile, there's another crisis at hand, 90 miles from the American shores in Cuba. Now, Cuba had gotten its independence in 1902. This was after the Spanish-American War. Eventually, Cuba got full independence. Tomas Palma was now the president, but there was a rebellion brewing as the Cuban people were not happy with the Palma government. About 20,000 rebels were on the outskirts of Havana. An unstable truce was in place, but Palma needed help, and he reached out to the Roosevelt administration in the United States. Now, why would he do that? This was consistent with the Cuban Constitution. Something that called the Platt Amendment from the United States had been inserted into the Cuban Constitution, and it read in part that the United States may exercise the right to intervene for the preservation of Cuban independence, the maintenance of a government adequate for the protection of life, property, and individual liberty. Well, that's basically what they needed at this point in time, and President Palma was asking for their help. That meant Will Taft. Taft was sent in September 21st, 1906. Bloodshed was imminent, and he took charge. He didn't just talk to the Palma government. He talked to the rebels, trying to figure out, could there be a compromise to avoid the bloodshed? Eventually, Taft found he had a lot of respect for Palma. He said, look, why don't you stay as president? But we got to disband this cabinet, realign it, some of your people, some of the opposition. This will be a compromise, and we can go forward. Palma said no. That was not his vision. He decided to resign. The entire cabinet resigned, and essentially there was no government left in Cuba. Anarchy was at hand, so what did Will Taft do? He's the man on the ground. He took over. He named himself the temporary head of the government, backed by the U.S. military. Marines were sent in. They were waiting off the coast all the time anyway. They came in for stability. The army would follow. Now, Taft reassured the Cuban people that the provisional government hereby established will be maintained only long enough to restore order, peace, and public confidence. In fact, he said, we're not putting up American flags all over the government buildings. Cuban flags will stay. Most of your civil servants will stay. He had gotten some calm, very decisive on Taft's part. Terrible time for him, what he called those awful 20 days. But Roosevelt was really proud of his Secretary of War. In fact, he said, I doubt whether you have ever rendered our country a greater service than the one you are now rendering. He had basically stopped a revolution in its tracks. It would take about 2.5 years before things would settle and the Cuban people would get their independent power back. But again, bloodshed was stopped in large part based on the actions of Will Taft. Taft back in the United States, that focus on the presidency continued to heat up with basically everybody except Taft himself. As far as he was concerned, he had more work to do, and Roosevelt was going to send him on the road yet again. Taft had promised the people of the Philippines that he would be there in person when the first National Assembly came together, and that was about to happen. So Roosevelt said, look, go to that, but go elsewhere as well. A world tour, if you will, of diplomatic discussions. And so the Tafts left for Japan, for China. In the Philippines, again, the returning hero, lots of banquets and celebrations for this new National Assembly that Taft had an opportunity to speak to, and he was asked the serious question, how long until independence? Well, Taft was honest with the Filipino people like he always was. We are engaged in working out a great experiment. No other nation has attempted it, and for us to fix a certain number of years in which the experiment must become a success and be completely realized would be, in my judgment, unwise. Taft was speculating maybe another generation before the Filipinos were truly ready for self-government at the rate they're going. Well, over time, the Filipinos would become frustrated because they thought they were ready maybe in about 10 years from there. It took 40 more years before they got their independence, actually after World War II. Taft would have been disappointed in that, but he was certainly happy at the progress that was being made at the time. But the Tafts left the Philippines. They had more journeys to Russia, to Germany. It was in Germany that Taft found out that his mother, Louisa, had passed away. Now, he knew that she was ill before he left. He might not be able to get back in time, but she was insistent. You had promised the people of the Philippines you would be there. He made the trip. By the time he got back to Cincinnati, it was in time to see her already buried next to her husband at the Spring Grove Cemetery in Cincinnati. Now, those two parents of William Taft, Adolfo and Louisa Taft, boy, they had a lot to be proud of their son. He had success so far in his life in just about everything he had done. He had gone to Yale, second in his class, Solicitor General of the United States, a federal judge, the Governor General of the Philippines, Secretary of War. These were hard jobs, and he had thrived in basically all of them. And now, all eyes were on him and the top spot, President of the United States. It was a job he really didn't want, but it was one he could not avoid, which is the story for another day. That is William Taft and Roosevelt's Jack of all trades from the life of William Taft. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher. This is Presidential Chronicles.